The game you play with your mind about if this was the only tree in the world, you magnify value. It's the capacity to pull back from the forever diluting nature of the busyness of life and the everything else that encroaches on the senses and on one's attention and presence of mind. So that is a practice, that is a discipline, that is a way of calling yourself to be present here and now to the fullness of something. It alerts me yet again that so much of what both of you are describing, there are many, many small practices that are part of the living in the day-to-day to be present to life, such that, I mean, you talked earlier about, and you talk now about the changing of the colors of the tree. So right there, the being present to the seasons. And for me, part of where, I don't call myself a poet, but I suppose if I was to try to access what is the poetic point of view, the poetic vantage point, one of the capacities I hear in what you are describing is, perhaps we can call it the hydraulic lift of poetry. It's the capacity to soar, to see something from above, the bird eye view, and then the capacity to move so close in to the microscopic view to enable you to magnify something so small to be so profoundly large to the exclusion of all else. That move from the very small to the very large, that to me is perhaps part of the hydraulic lift of poetry. You are able to move both directions in all other directions.
Mm-hmm. So here's a sticky note that's right on my computer here, and it says, "Nothing is too small to contain the whole world." And I read that in an interview, and I put it here because of exactly what you're saying, is that sort of zooming in and zooming out, and the seasonality of like it's the best metaphor ever, right? The metaphor of seasonality, but the notion of how it's the metaphor, right? When I said at the beginning, we're trying to say the unsayable and we're crazy enough to try to go for it. When we're at the edge of those portals, the edge of reason, the edge of logic, the edge of the stories we've already told, or, we have to, first it's trust, faith, I don't know what you want to call it, to go on in there. And then I think that it's about, all right, well, we're trying to describe something that is so enormous and so small at the same time. It's this abstract concept, or, like one of the things when I used to actually teach the writing of poetry, the very first assignment I would give to people was, all right, I want you to write the worst love poem you've ever written. And it's a bit of a, it's a trick. By the way, Aviv, you're totally a poet, so we're having a separate podcast on that. But so it's like love, the emotion of love, to love one's partner or child or country or whatever, like it's completely inexpressible. Like you can't do it. So it comes out sounding like a Hallmark card. It's awful. So that's the assignment. Like, say the thing that's the hardest thing to say. And that's why we have to go to metaphor and season and the things that maybe we can perceive with our senses, because then we can get close. And Mary Oliver was the master of that, right? You read along in her poem, she's like, you're out walking with the dog, you're smelling the skunk cabbage, and then boom, all of a sudden you're like, whoa, that's not what this was about. And she was a master of it, and so accessible, which is why she was so beloved and is still.
You mentioned Mary Oliver, so I'm off. I'm sort of reveling in the field of my beloved Mary Oliver poems here, and that presence she had. But my favorite thing about her work was that she would take you along and then whammo. And what I wanted to mention was that sometimes the wham the message comes from a source that I don't know what it is. I'll call it source. In terms of practices, one of the practices for me is listening. And it's not only listening for what I'm going to hear other people say that might give me snippets of conversation, but it's deep listening inside, because sometimes I get a message. And the message will often end up being the last line or part of the last stanza of what will eventually be a poem. And I know what it feels like when I get those. And I'm not someone who is so clairaudient that I'm getting communications like that all the time. I mean, I know there are people who do, but no. So when I get something like that, it's like, ooh, okay then. So that's another practice. And I'd be curious, Libby, as to whether that happens with you as well sometimes, where you just something shows up and you go, okay.
Oh, absolutely. And I, I have, because I'm superstitious this way, right? But I have receipts, napkins, scraps of paper, crap, all, where I write it down as quick as I can, because I know if I don't honor it right then, it's gone. It's just gone. And it will be like, oh yeah, I had that really cool line, or I had that really cool image, or that thought that came to me, or whatever. And so it's about like honoring when the imaginative, poetic, artistic impulse is in that conversation with you. I love the idea of call and response. I'm gonna have to like riff on that or something, but that's the call. And if I don't respond, then I give it up. And I think, like when you look at artists who, live tortured lives and are, commit suicide and all that kind of thing. I mean, I realize that's again, another topic, but I think it's because we get so addicted to the idea that we're going to get it. And where is it? Where is it? Where is it? Where's the thing? Where's the thing? Where's the brilliance? And so that we get so amped up, we cannot be in that place of neutrality, that it's just open, and realizing that it's like a miracle when you get it. Like, I think everyone can get it, but I think it's miraculous. It's like, I planted this little tiny squash plant out in my backyard garden, and I know there's a scientific explanation, but how did it get so massive in a week? Like, it's like, I want to have, what is that, stop photography or whatever, like in the middle of the night, that's like viewing my squash plant. How does that happen? It's miraculous. I don't know how to describe it, but I think that getting the message, the calling, whatever it is. I mean, it's, again, it sounds so corny when we try to describe it, because it's that thing that's beyond language again.
So you're again bringing the practice of neutrality. And Holly, you spoke of listening, that when you describe, I hear the practice of listening to yourself, listening, and perhaps there is even a third layer of listening to yourself, listening to your listening, perhaps, where some of the call and response theater can begin to happen in the multidimensionality of that experience, where you witness the witnessing you, right?
Yes. And then that is all, that can all be wonderful and transcendent, and sometimes it can be as confusing as can be. And then as a poet, the fact that I'm also a professional editor adds a whole other level of like, how do I keep that part out of it until the impulse has been put on the page? And then how do I craft it into something that has that life, a better version, as opposed to taking the life out of it in the process of editing it. So there's the listening, and then there's the sculpting, and then there's the over polishing, knowing when it's like, okay, the fact that might be a little bit of a rough edge is perfect, as opposed to, no, got to smooth it out. So I was kind of slipping into the practice of the refinement of like the craft, as opposed to where it originally comes from. But sometimes, knowing what I'm listening to and where I am on that spectrum can itself get quite confusing. And that at that point, I usually just have to put it down, step away, come back in a month, come back in 6 months, come back in 2 years, whatever, and look at it again and say, okay, what does it want to be now? Which brings up another question that we could get into or not get into. There's so many different directions. The question of who is it that I'm capturing in the poem? And as I change, as I go back through my work, does the work change with me? Or do I leave it as a record of who I was then?
Well, do you want to answer your own question?
It's a yes, I can.
Or would you like me to make it more complex even and overlay something else into it?
Oh, go ahead, feel free.
Well, so while you contemplate your own question, one of the threads that seems to be revealing through the conversation, because you spoke at the beginning about metamorphosis and Libby spoke about the caterpillar. And so there is something, there is this thread that appeals through that, because if I held a little rock in my palm, well, that rock already has arrived and met its destiny, in the sense that I could probably hold it for 10,000 years or longer and it will not change unless it is exposed to tremendous heat or other shape-shifting power. So what are we saying here? We are describing that part of the inner anatomy of transformation relates to or is apparent at the convergence of different octaves. In nature, you describe it as being exposed to the elements. So even the dry piece of wood, when it is exposed to fire, it will go through its transformation, where the rock perhaps would not, unless there is tremendous heat. What are we saying? We're saying that in natural processes and in ourselves, transformation is emergent when different octaves, when different realms with different levels of process seem to be able to find each other in one space, in a unifying crucible that allows that process to be revealed. And to me, when you are describing the listening to yourself listening, you are introducing in the babushkas, the Russian dolls, that you are on the inside, you are creating the inner space where that transformational process can arise. And I'm suggesting in this imagery that for transformation to be allowed, typically, or my observation is, you'll need to have 3 levels or 3 octaves at play. This is why earlier I talked about you do the work, you transform the work, you transform yourself. It's the same is true in relationship. If we want to develop sustained relationships, well, there is the relationship that wants to be sustained. Then if it is to be sustained, we have to continue to evolve and transform that relationship, because nothing is static. But to actually be engaged in a transformational relationship, we each need to continually be transformed on the inside, or else we cannot engage in a transformational way. Right there is the 3 octaves. So that's what I hear when you describe the 3 levels of listening in your process. I promised I will make it a little more complex and compound. So play jazz with that, please.
Oh my goodness. Well, the other ingredient is time in transformation, because when I was putting my book together, I was drawing on poems that I'd written 20 years ago and poems that I'd written the year before. And one of the choices I needed to make with each poem was, who am I showing the world in this poem, and who do I want to show the world in this poem? Which is, very totally acknowledged. There's definitely an egoic piece of this, putting work out into the world. But also asking the work itself, is there something new that wants to come in here? Or is it important to let this one be as it was, even if I'm no longer the person who would write that poem? Even if and I'm speaking mostly of poems that have to do with spiritual exploration of some kind. So if as my understanding has matured or evolved or shifted, how do I engage with the transformation that was happening then, as opposed to all the transformation that may have happened subsequent to that? What do I put out there in the world? And so that adds another level of listening and ego management and craft, because there's also levels of like, okay, I may be changing the poem fundamentally, but it's going to be a better poem. Well, according to what criteria? What criteria am I? And for me, so much of it is intuitive. It's by ear, and it's intuitive as well as language arts. So all of that, everything you're talking about comes in. And some of the poems, I wouldn't say this for all of my poems necessarily, but some poems themselves are living beings. That's how they seem to be to me. And I don't mean, I see them the way I see a human being, but I mean, there's a live transmission that feels like the poem was a gift and it wants to be shared, and my job is to not mess it up. And if it was a gift 15 years ago, but I would no longer see things that way, is it still, I have to really tune into it and say, okay, is it important to leave this one expressing the version of me, the heart and the soul and the body that it came through then? Is that what needs to go out into the world? Or am I trying to show, and here's the ego part, am I trying to show how much I've grown since then? Like all these different factors can come into play. And so, yeah, it gets, sometimes it can be, I had one three-line poem that went through probably 1,000 different iterations, just like who, and it was really just a confrontation, like, who am I trying to be in these words? What am I trying to present myself as in these, and why? And I never was satisfied. I never answered the question. So it can be as, it can be as intense as that. Yeah. So, when is it about me? When is it about a message for the world? When is it about just an observation that's in beautiful language that might move someone to observe more themselves? It's like poetry covers everything.